Welcome to Midweek Murders, where we take a look at true crime around Australia. In this episode, we'll be looking into the person responsible for West Australians locking their doors at night. Today, we dive into the man who was called the Night Caller, only to be renamed as the Nedlands Monster. Eric Edgar Cooke was born in February 1931 in Victoria Park, Perth. He was the eldest of three and was born into an unhappy, violent home. His parents only married because the mother was pregnant with him. His father was an abusive alcoholic, attacking the mother and Eric when he tried to protect her. Cookie was born with a cleft lip and palate, for which he received one surgery when he was 3 months and another when he was 3.5. The surgeries were not entirely successful, leaving Cookie with a slight facial deformity and speech impairment. This resulted in him being bullied in school, causing him to withdraw and become an outcast. His aptitude for crime began at Subiaco State School, where at the tender age of 6, he was expelled for stealing money from a teacher's purse. Being transferred to Newcastle Street Infant School was the same ordeal as being in Subiaco. He was bullied relentlessly, regardless of the schools he attended, which were Highgate Primary School, Forest Street Primary School, and Newcastle Street Junior Technical School. Along with the bullying at school, Cookie was placed in several orphanages and foster homes. Like his mother, he would hide under the house or roam neighbouring streets to escape his father's violence. He was hospitalised for head injuries and had suspected brain damage from his accident proneness. Cookie also had recurrent headaches and was once admitted to an asylum for blackouts. These reported blackouts stopped after an operation in 1949. Cookie dropped out of school at the age of 14 to work as a delivery boy for Central Provision Stores in order to support the family. He would give his weekly wages to his mother, who could not fully support the family with the money she earned from cooking and cleaning. Starting at the age of 17, Cookie spent his nights involved in petty crimes, vandalism and arson. He would later spend 18 months in prison for burning down a church where he was rejected from a choir audition. Later, Cookie would sneak into houses and steal whatever he found valuable. These crimes escalated into damaging clothes and furniture in acts of vengeance. Still trying to make friends, Cookie would collect the newspaper clippings and show acquaintances in the hopes they would be impressed. March 12, 1949 was when the police finally caught up with Cookie, finding evidence in his grandmother's house where he was living. His fingerprints were matched to those on file in other open cases. May 24th, Cookie was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being arrested for arson and vandalism. He was convicted on 2 charges of stealing, 7 of breaking and entering, and 4 of arson. Knowing what was used to catch him made him careful in his future crimes. During the 1950s and early 1960s, people often left their cars unlocked, even with the keys still in the ignition. Cookie enjoyed taking the cars, sometimes returning them without the owner being any the wiser. In September of 1959, Cookie crashed a car and was rushed to the hospital. He was sentenced to 2 years hard labour on a charge of unlawful use of a motor vehicle. He was ultimately released from Fremantle Prison just prior to Christmas of 1956. After his release, he took to wearing gloves during his crimes, not wanting his fingerprints responsible for his capture again. The murder spree began in 1959, involving a series of seemingly unrelated hit-and-runs, stabbings, strangulations, and shootings. Victims were shot with different rifles, stabbed with knives and scissors, hit with cars, and beaten with an axe. Several were killed after waking up to find Cookie robbing their homes. 2 were shot while they slept, their house left undisturbed, and 1 was shot while answering the doorbell. 1 victim was strangled with the cord of a bedside lamp. The corpse was then defiled by Cookie before he dragged it out to a neighbour's front lawn, where it was defiled for a second time with a whiskey bottle. The victims were Pena or Penny Berkman, Julie McPherson Brewer, John Lindsay Sturkey, George Orman Walmsley, Rosemary Anderson, Constance Lucy Madrill, Shirley Martha McLeod, and Brian Vincent Weir, who died 3 years after being shot by Cookie. Due to the different methods of death, the victims were not tied to any one individual. 2 of the victims, Gillian Brewer and Rosemary Anderson, were attributed to other men who were wrongfully convicted of those crimes, despite Cookie admitting to those deaths and giving details that only the killer would know. It was still years before Daryl Beamish and John Button would be exonerated. Mr. Beamish served 15 years in prison, while Mr. Button was sentenced to 10 years on a manslaughter charge and served 5. When apprehended and the trial began, Cooke attempted to plead not guilty on the grounds of insanity. After being examined by a mental health professional, he was deemed not insane and fit for trial. The trial lasted 2 days, beginning on November 25th and concluding on November 27th. The jury took just over an hour to come back with a guilty verdict. Cooke was sentenced to death by hanging in Fremantle Prison. October 26, 1964, 11 months after being sentenced, Cooke was hanged at 8 a.m. Even before his death, Cooke claimed responsibility for the deaths of Miss Brewer and Miss Anderson, but these claims were still ignored because 2 men were already convicted for those crimes. Cooke was buried in Fremantle Cemetery. Thanks to Cooke's 4-year killing spree, Western Australia began locking their cars and doors at night. Apparently, there was an influx of people buying dogs for protection as well. Eric Edgar Cooke was, perhaps, the most prolific serial killer WA has to offer. He was the one that changed the way of life in the sleepy state. He tore the innocence of this state away, violently showing the people that monsters exist and they could be a neighbour, or a colleague, or the delivery man. Thank you for listening to Midweek Murders. I will leave the links in the description if you wish to dive further into Cooke's mind. Until next week, stay safe.